Retina IIIc. This one is apparently in wonderful condition, but the shutter's stuck. At least that's what I was told. Let's see what we can discover. There's something really odd about that frame counter. There's a big gap between the top of the camera and the frame counter disc. I've got no idea what's going on there. Nothing good, that's for sure. Anyway, let's have a quick look around the outside of the camera. That meter door, that's sticking. What's happened there? I'd say that the hinges, the casting, this hinge, these points here, they've almost certainly been bashed in. So it's been pushed this way at the top, which means the door doesn't want to swing down correctly. So we know the camera's been dropped. Certainly something really odd with that frame counter. It looks like the top of the camera's been punched in there. Anything to see at the bottom? Not a lot. A little bit of corrosion around there. Fair bit of sand by the looks of it. Focus, quite stiff. Rangefinder. Yeah, there is a rangefinder image. It's even relatively accurate, but very, very dirty and hazy. The exposure meter, it does react to light, so that's good. What happens if we cock the shutter? Film advance swings. Very reluctant to move back to the rest position. Looks like the arm's a bit bent there. Depress the shutter release, nothing happens. Oh, I just heard the self-timer run. Yeah, shutter itself didn't fire though. So someone had set the self-timer, and the shutter is most certainly not releasing. It may not be cocking correctly. Yeah, just a weak hit. It may not be cocking all the way, or it may just be stuck. The lens is very, very dirty. I'm going to go and warm that shutter up with the hairdryer. If it's just stuck with oil, that'll probably make the shutter fire. If it's more than that, and I suspect it is, I strongly suspect that the shutter cocking rack might have skipped a tooth, then that's not going to make any difference at all. So back shortly. Well, I warmed it up with the hairdryer, no good. Absolutely no change in behaviour there at all. So I suspect we have problems with the shutter cocking rack, and we'll climb into the top of this and see if we can find out what's gone on. So, off with the rewind knob. Two screws on the top cover at this end. One at the end here. That frame counter, did I check to see if it actually moves? Oh, it does move. It's not lining up correctly, but it does move. Right, that screw's quite tight. Might mean that that's a bit distorted. Well, we know the top cover's quite a bit distorted. Let's lift the top cover off. I'll take out the two screws that hold the meter in place. That screw's loose. That screw's loose. Is there anything to be seen here? Let's just remove a bit of the overburden. Yep. If you look closely here, I'll zoom you in. Wrong way. Now, watch the teeth on the rack here relative to this gear at the top. You see, as I move that further along and those teeth come under load as it cocks the shutter, you see that the gap's widening up between the rack and the teeth on the gear. And they're just touching on the very tips there. Almost certainly that's jumped a tooth, and the rack is effectively pushing away from the gear. So something's loose here most likely. We'll see if we can see what it is. Take that screw out. This screw here is a shoulder screw that supports the rack to stop it from pushing away from the gear. That screw's not loose. That's quite tight. This screw here that holds the gear on the top of the shaft, is that loose? That appears quite tight. But we certainly have too much clearance at this point. These teeth on the rack are a little bit worn, but they're certainly not damaged to the point where the rack would be useless. But certainly the gap here is too big. Let's remove this chrome trim. So, oh, that screw's loose. I'm just taking out the strap lug from this end of the chrome trim on the top cover. Lift that off so we can get at things. Is that screwed? That screw's tight too. I'm going to remove the rangefinder. Now if we slacken off this screw and that screw, can we move the whole Film Advance bush across? Possibly. I'm looking to see how much movement I've got here. It doesn't look like I've got much. Certainly that was part of the thing. Part of the problem is that the bush that holds the top of our Film Advance shaft here is possibly worn, and the shaft was effectively pushing away from the rack. Now there's another possible solution to this too. This piece here, this screw, the shoulder screw, that came in two flavours. There was one called a service replacement, and the service replacement effectively had a larger diameter head here, and the effect of that larger diameter head was to hold the rack in firm contact with that rack and the gear. So let's just take the rack out completely, see if we can move that thing all the way over. This rack here looks like it's one tooth out just on its positioning here too. I would have expected that to be one tooth further advanced. I'm going to move that forward one tooth, put it back, and see if this cocks and fires. I suspect it might. It may well be that this shutter cocking rack, although as I say it's a little bit worn, is we've got to it just in time. That effectively it's been saved from death. Put that on there lightly. Right, if I cock the shutter, that was the shutter releasing then, or at least attempting to release. So yes, that's certainly part of our problem, is that the shutter wasn't cocking all the way. It might still not be quite getting there. But yeah, there's problems there, alright. Okay, I'll strip this all down. I hope that we can get away without replacing any of these components. But I won't know until after I've either been successful or haven't. Well, I've had the body completely apart, cleaned everything. Everything's working nice and smoothly in here. Film advance. Shutter cocking rack, I thought that was in quite good condition. So what I'm going to do now is pop this shutter back in. Now, I found a few things bent on this camera. This would be one of them. Look at the state of that shutter release. Now that's bent right down. How would you go about doing that? Well, one way you can do that is to hammer your finger down on the shutter release really hard. Another way would be to drop the camera on its head so that the shutter release button was thumped in really hard. Now we already know that the top of the camera had been thumped in because the frame counter mechanism was all distorted. So that suggests to me that that was part of the problem with the shutter. It probably wasn't releasing correctly. There was insufficient movement there. However, let's put this on the camera, find out whether the shutter will actually function, whether it will cock and fire. Well, it sort of cocks, but it's not, the blades aren't moving at all. I'm just going to listen to that action again. Yeah, it's certainly, the shutter's not going to go. There's no problem with the cocking action, but the shutter is just simply gummed up. You can see the state of that lens there. It doesn't look very pretty, does it? It's going to need a wee bit of cleaning, I'd say. So, shutter back off. I'll put the camera body to one side, and I think we'll delve into the shutter and see what's happening here, or not happening as the case may be. Well, I'll start by removing the rear lens group, the retaining ring, the shim rings. That's very oily. There's a metal one there, there's a paper one here. Of course, that's stuck down fairly well with the oil. Oh, there's multiple paper ones here. I want to get them off in one piece, preferably, because they're a bugger to put back if you tear them. Take off the front group, and here's the shutter. Anything to see here? Not an awful lot. The shutter blades are quite dirty looking, and I don't think I'm imagining a fingerprint on those blades. So someone's had a poke at that to see what would happen. We'll remove the single screw from the retaining ring. Now that screw is very easily lost and is not uncommonly missing. And of course it's, I don't have lots of spares. In fact, I'm lucky if I can ever find one spare. I've got just about every shutter that's come my way as parts, to use as parts, has had that removed. Right, off with this. Here's the aperture numbers which show at the top of the shutter. This is our lens mount here. These little notches in here form the click stops for your shutter speed settings. We'll take the shutter speed setting ring off here and the shutter speed settings cam plate and have a look at the shutter itself, see what's going on. That's cocked. Just get a weak sound, and that's coming from the excuse me, the flash sync mechanism, but the shutter itself isn't releasing. Delve into it a bit deeper. I suspect that the shutter blades are just glued shut with oil. Remove that internal cocking ring. Get the spring off the post. And take that pinion out. You can see that the main drive cam here is released because it's no longer caught behind at this point, but nothing's moving. It's picked up the blade actuating ring, but nothing wants to move. As our self-timer is not causing the problem, I'll remove the self-timer and the retard gear train from the shutter and see a bit more. I don't know why that's reluctant to come out. I'm going to unhook the main spring. It's been sitting there fully tensioned for some time. That spring is not looking very happy. We'll lift the main cam out there, I think. I can't get the blade actuating ring to move at all there. Let's remove a bit more. Those aren't the pliers I was looking for, but we'll use them anyway. Very interesting. Okay, let's delve in a bit deeper. Removing a few more springs, taking care to make sure they don't disappear off into the distance. Usually I do that by placing something over the spring so it can't get away, typically a toothpick or a screwdriver or something. Oh, let's have the shutter case off there from the back. Our flash contact has been tightened up very well, probably more than it needs. That screws the wrong screw there. That screws a foreigner. That's the wrong size. It means that the shutter would rattle loose. That screw's job is to locate the shutter in this groove here. The screw head obviously has to fit that groove quite neatly. That screw would not. It would mean that the shutter would float. It would only be held firmly in position by the tension on the retaining ring. So that's a mistake that someone's made when they've reassembled the camera. They've lost the original screw, presumably, and they fitted something that was not suitable. I'm taking the 3 screws from here. This is the aperture setting lever, which I haven't tested to see if the blades move freely or not. Frequently when the shutter blades won't move, the diaphragm blades are often stuck too. They are. They do not want to move at all. They are glued, absolutely glued shut, or glued open in this case. 3 screws hold the mechanism plate and the shutter case together. Of course, if you were doing this, you'd be carefully putting the parts out, neatly laid out, so that you knew exactly where everything came from. Alright, okay, so some answers are coming forward. You can probably see the oil there. See that shiny stuff? That shiny stuff is oil, liquid oil. That is gluing everything together. You heard that click? That's the shutter blades. They're glued together with oil. There's no danger that they were going to move. So that's the sign of a shutter that certainly needs to be serviced. That's a lot of oil. Probably not enough for me to suspect that someone squirted oil in there, but it's a lot of oil. The diaphragm, or the retainer plate, looks quite greasy. I can see some loose liquid oil right there. We remove the 3 screws that hold the retainer plate in place. Here's the moving plate that swings the blades in and out. You can see that the diaphragm blades here are glued to it. Now you can often take diaphragm blades out as a rosette. You can't take them out when they're opened up to full aperture unless they're glued together with oil. So basically the problem here with this shutter is the oil. This should be clean and dry. The blades are actually a different colour when they're clean. They are more charcoal grey than that shiny black. So all of this will need to be carefully cleaned. Just sweep that stuff aside. And the mechanism plate here, I'll disassemble this. 3 screws hold the lens tube to the mechanism plate, and the blade actuating ring is held in place between the lens tube and the blade actuating mechanism plate. Right, there we go. So that shutter is all in pieces, and I'll have to start cleaning all that lot up and put it back together. But I don't see any serious issues there apart from the greasiness of it. We'll see if it's going to go for us once it's done. If there's an issue, it's the main spring here. This spring is just worn out. If you take this leg of the spring as being at 12 o'clock, that one stands there at well down around after 4 o'clock, I would say. It should be at about the 2 o'clock position on a fresh spring. Fresh springs are thin on the ground. This one is exceptionally tired, and they get this way by the camera being left in the cocked position for a long period of time, which of course when you're dealing with a camera that's 60 years old It could easily have been sitting there for 20 years at a stretch in the cocked position. Well, here you can see the diaphragm blades, and although I've cleaned these carefully to get rid of any oil, they're still obviously quite marked. Now, this is a corrosion pattern, I believe. It may be from the oil, it may be like a lacquer as oils age. You know, they tend to form like a lacquer that just won't dissolve easily with solvent, and it may be that, but it's also possible that's some sort of corrosion on those blades. Now, normally I do not polish diaphragm blades because the danger of damaging them is very high, because they have the little pivots on them, the rivets. It's very easy to catch them on the cleaning cloth or the cotton bud you're using to polish them. So I try to avoid polishing them when at all possible. In this case, although the diaphragm does move very freely now, there's certainly no problem there at all. It'll just open and close nice and smoothly. I just don't like the look of them. So I'm going to disassemble that. There, you can see the marks on the back of them there too. And I'll polish these with brass soap. And I've also got to do the shutter blades, so they're quite clearly quite marked. But I'm not expecting any other problems reassembling the shutter. Well, I've polished those blades up. As you can see, that those corrosion marks that were present are gone. There's some shading across those blades. Now that's almost certainly because in the polishing action I've polished, I know I've polished further down the blade than up near the pivot points, just as a matter of normal usage. And probably polished off the rear edge of the blades more than the front, the leading edge. Again, because I was being careful not to have the cotton bud pick up on the edge of the blade and pull it back and bend it. But the blades are all clean now. The corrosion marks are gone. They'll move nice and smoothly. Well, they did anyway previously, but they still move nice and smoothly. And there is no visible fault with those blades. Not that there was a serious fault in terms of function before, but they just looked ugly. So that's our diaphragm blades all cleaned and ready to go, and now I've just got to polish up the shutter blades before I start reassembling the rest of the shutter. So the final result, here's the camera. Everything moves nice and smoothly. Shutter blades nice and clean, all polished. Diaphragm blades the same. So what needed done? Well, obviously the shutter was very oily, needed a lot of work in there cleaning that. On the camera body, the top cover had been pushed in so that the frame counter was distorted. That had to be straightened up. The strap lug at this end was quite bent. The flap on the meter, I tried moving those hinges. One of them snapped off, so that was the end of that. So I had to move the meter to a different housing. But that looks fine now. The bottom of the camera, not much to report there. The advance lever was bent. It was bent quite a considerable amount. And as a result, the advance lever didn't want to come back to the park position. It was catching on the body at that point. So that certainly needed to be dealt to. The rangefinder, that was a bit grimy as I said, otherwise it was quite good. All in all, it's a good camera now. The lens cleaned up well. The only thing that sort of gave me any amount of trouble with the lens was the rear group. I had to dismantle the rear group because one of the interior surfaces was quite hazy, an oil haze on it I think, which would go along with all the rest of the oil problems that this camera had. But it's all good now. Self-timer works. You can hear that running down. And it can go back to its owner. And now it is. a nice example. Thanks for watching.